I thought this morning I would talk a little bit about the wonderful role that Catholic Charities plays in this community from the perspective of the CEO of a healthcare system. And I think it actually does make our work a great deal easier. I think their contributions are enormously important, but in some respects, perhaps unknown. So as it relates to what I do, now that we're growing larger and larger, I'm often visiting hospitals. And typically, when I go to a hospital, I try to get to the emergency department, either as I arrive or just as I'm about to leave. It's, for me, a wonderful chance to really see the fabric of the organization. It's a quick opportunity to see the doctors and the nurses, the intensity of what's going on, and many times it's a window into the culture of the place. And this year, for instance, we'll have more than 250,000 emergency department visits within our health system. So it's a very busy spot. And as I go through some of the emergency departments from time to time, I see familiar faces, people that we've seen before. And sometimes you see people very frequently, and we actually started a program several years ago. We call it Familiar Faces, where we take a look at people who frequent the hospital pretty regularly. And you would be surprised at how often some people do visit the ED. We have people, typically we look at people who are in at least once a month. But we do have people that are in, we had a woman last year, for instance, who was in over 140 times to the emergency department. And she was incarcerated for 2 months, so it would have been higher than that had she been out. But it's astonishing, and we actually took an inventory to say, what's going on here? What do these people need? And it's often not medical care. We have 575 people now in this program. That's just in 3 of our hospitals, people that are in all the time. And we have a team, and you may have heard about it, the community care teams, which does great work, and Catholic Charities is a vital part of that effort. But what we do is we basically, I used to ask the question, what's wrong with these people? But I think that's the wrong question. It's what's happened to these people. And by that I mean most of these people either have a mental illness, they have a problem with an addiction, they're homeless, they're poor, they're victims of some sort of violence at home, they are hopeless, sometimes they're here illegally, they don't have a job, they cannot read, or some combination thereof. These are people whose the bottom has fallen out of their lives. And we spend a lot of time trying to organize care plans specific for their needs, which are often complex. So when they come into the emergency department, they don't need intravenous fluids, they don't need a suture lacerated. They need their lives put back together. And that's really the social dimension of their lives that needs to be addressed. But if you don't do both, it becomes very unbalanced. I'll give you an example. 28-year-old young man with type 1 diabetes. He needs insulin, and he lost his job. He's now homeless. He is living in his friend's abandoned house. It's no heat. He doesn't want to get caught, so he approaches the house from the back. And in order to get into the house, he walks through marsh. He has holes in his shoes. He can't afford his insulin, and he doesn't really have access to fresh food when he breaks into this house. So he'll show up to the emergency department, and he'll have something, a foot ulcer. We take care of the foot ulcer, we clean it up, send him out. He goes back with his wet feet to his cold home without fresh food and with irregular access to insulin. He comes back in a month later, we amputate one of his toes. Another month, we amputate another toe. All the while, the bills are getting serious. Then it's a below-knee amputation. What this young man needs is a $50 pair of shoes, and he needs access to fresh food, he needs a roof over his head, and he needs somebody who cares about him, who'll make sure he gets his insulin. But that's one of the problems with healthcare in the United States, is that we don't fully appreciate the social determinants of healthcare. It isn't about the microcirculation in his foot. It's about a pair of shoes, and it's about a heated home. And we deal with that all of the time. And in fact, if you look at, there's an interesting comparison. If you look at healthcare in the United States, we spend a lot of money on healthcare. You all know that. Last year, we spent $3.5 trillion on healthcare. That's $10,700 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Far more than any other country in the world. Twice as much as the number 2 country in the industrialized world. 19% of our gross domestic product. So we're spending a lot of money. And people will sometimes say, well, you know, the U.S. is spending a fortune on healthcare. And, you know, our outcomes, and I'll talk about this in a moment, are okay. They're not great. For all that money, what are we getting? And a recent book by Elizabeth Bradley actually pointed out an important statistic, I think, that gets left out of this comparison. If you look at the United States and its healthcare spend, but put next to it its spend on social services, and by that I mean assistance with housing, subsidies for food, subsidies for utilities, welfare, old age pensions, child care assistance, education. If you put all of those numbers together, we spend about 10% of our GDP on social services. Other countries, other industrialized countries, spend much more than that. They spend twice what we spend. So if you lump the two together, what did we spend on health care and what did we spend on social services? We're pretty average. But what is telling is the ratio. For every dollar that most countries in the industrialized world spend on health care, they invest $2 for social services, to get the kid the pair of shoes, to make sure he's got a heated home and has access to fresh food. In the United States, for every dollar we spend on health care, we spend 60 cents on the social service sector. That's a problem, and I'll tell you why, because the data, when you analyze it, there's a strong correlation between how much you spend on the social aspects, the social services, relative to healthcare services. Most, it's, as I say, 2 to 1. The major health outcomes seem to be directly linked to that ratio. When you underinvest in social services, you pay for it with exorbitant healthcare costs. For instance, the United States, average life expectancy today is 78.6 years. Out of 31 industrialized nations, that's number 28. Now, we have fallen every year for 3 years. The last time life expectancy fell for 3 consecutive years in the United States was in 1918, after World War I and the great flu pandemic. So something's happening. Other much smaller countries are marching past us because it seems that they understand the important investment that needs to be made in the social infrastructure, all the wonderful programs that you saw on the slideshow and that Tony just talked about. If you fail to invest there, you're going to pay for it with exorbitant healthcare costs, and in fact, poorer outcomes. We're 28 in life expectancy. We're number 31 for infant mortality. Our average infant mortality rate is 70% higher than the rest of the world. This is the United States. Percentage of children born, low birth weight newborns in the United States, we're 26 out of 31. So we can do better. And I think what we have to remember is that the kinds of services that we just talked about here this morning that are provided by Catholic Charities, that's exactly what we need. It is assistance to the homeless. It is morning glory and feeding the hungry. It is the financial service program where you're giving these small loans to people. Mental health counseling, 60% of the people on that list, that familiar faces list, have some sort of mental illness. Addiction is an enormous problem. Assistance to immigrants. which Catholic Charities has done for so long, is so vital. So let's talk about that. I actually became very interested in the history of Catholic Charities because Nancy said, listen, John, they want you to speak at the breakfast, and I've heard you speak a lot. It'd be nice if you knew what you were talking about for a change. So I said, I better bone up on this. But it was interesting. If you look at, when Catholic Charities really got its start, after the Civil War, there was this great influx of immigrants from around the world to this great country. And they came to our big cities. They came to New York and to Boston and to Baltimore and to St. Louis and to Pittsburgh and to Chicago. So I started looking at some of the work in New York City. How did Catholic Charities get started there? And it was interesting and upsetting when you see these waves of immigrants arrive on the shores of the United States, and they arrive in New York. There was an enormous bias against Catholics. I don't know, I suspect you know that, but I didn't realize how bad it was. I read in one paper, an annual report published by an outfit called the Association for Improvement in Child Poverty. It was basically a state of the city. And in the report, I remember the author writing that he made reference to the children of Irish Catholic immigrants as the accumulated trash of New York City. Now, my 4 grandparents were in that pile of trash. There was another report from the Children's Aid Society, and its author, whose name I still remember, said that 99% of the wretched denizens of New York City's holes are Catholics. And there was actually an effort led by the Children's Aid Society. It was led and financed by a Connecticut-born gentleman by the name of Charles Brace, who said, look, I know how to fix this. I know how to rescue these children. We need to get them out of their homes. So he led an effort to emotionally and physically separate children from, his term, the degeneracy of their Catholic parents. And he sent tens of thousands of children from New York City out west. I mean, that happened in the late 19th century. That was the turning point where Catholic Charities said, we've had enough. They denounced it, and they said, we will fix this. We will take care of our own. And they did. They built these child care institutions and adoption agencies, parochial schools, orphanages. But they decided they had had enough. And they also started to figure out, we have to influence how policies are made. Dave and I were talking about this a moment ago, and Mark and I were chatting about it. They realized pretty early on, we have got to figure out who let that man come into our homes and send our children away. So they began to influence policy making at the local level, at the state level, and at the federal level. And it really, I think, reached its apex back then when New York City elected its first Catholic mayor, William R. Grace. He stood up for the poor, and he assisted Catholic Charities in their endless efforts to support the poor. And I think it's important for us to remember that. We live in the Danbury area. Danbury has been home to immigrants for a long time. I suspect you all know this, but Danbury is the most diverse city in the state of Connecticut. Danbury is the 11th most diverse city in the United States. A third of its citizens are foreign-born. Our ability to accept and welcome immigrants began more than 100 years ago with the Irish and the Italians and the Germans, and then it was the Slavs and the Swedes and the Poles and the Syrians and the Lebanese. And then more recently, it was the Portuguese and the Brazilians and the Chinese, the Greeks, the Mexicans. But everybody came, everybody was welcomed. Catholic Charities had a hand in that. And that's why I think it's such a wonderful community today. But Catholic Charities then, as the 20th century came, what was a hugely important step is the Catholic social worker. I think they really modernized the agency. And it was the social workers who were professional and competent who said, look, we will always be advocates for the poor, but we are going to figure out how to provide service and how to get access to some of these public funds. And they never forgot their loyalty to the Catholic community. But I think they really advanced and modernized Catholic Charities. And then comes the New Deal in World War II. Catholic Charities was very busy at that time because they were both an advocate and a service provider. But they did something that I think is very important that we keep in mind. They said, we are no longer just advocates for the Catholic poor. We want to stand up for and serve all the poor, regardless of their race or creed, emphasizing the Church's love for the poor in spirit. And that really became what Catholic Charities is today. They're not just giving assistance to Catholics, they're giving assistance to the poor. I got data from the Diocese of Baltimore. Last year, 70% of their aid went to non-Catholics. And last year, I mean, you should know this, Catholic Charities is the largest system of private social provision in the United States. 1,400 agencies and institutions across the country, 200,000 volunteers, taking care of more than 11 million people. And they are doing God's work. And I can tell you again, from the perspective of a healthcare system, the work that they are doing is work that needs to be done. I've also been around Hartford and more recently Washington, D.C. enough to know that trying to flip the switch on that ratio of spending, it's going to take a long time before it ever happens here. I mean, just trying to reduce the spend on healthcare in the United States today is enormously difficult. And then taking a whole chunk of that money and investing it to social services, I don't see that happening anytime soon. What I do see happening is that Catholic Charities needs to continue its work because it is vital to our community, not only purely for aiding those who are poor, but it does in fact improve their health. It does in fact improve the health of the community. But the leaders of Catholic Charities today know and face the same realities that the leaders of Catholic Charities knew and faced 150 years ago. Private charity alone is not going to take care of the needs of the millions of poor. It has to be a shared responsibility with public and private responsibility. There has to be, in the broadest sense, an acceptance that the poor belong to all of us. The other thing that I want you to remember about Catholic Charities is they have been remarkably successful over more than a century because they've been so adaptive and so inventive and so committed. But what strikes me, particularly in how over the years with every administration, regardless of party, at the state level or at the federal level, they resisted secularization. It was never just about giving stuff away. It was about serving God and achieving eternal salvation. I think that the fundamental nature of the work of Catholic Charities is a message of Christian love. That's what it's about. In 1987, St. Pope John Paul II visited San Antonio, and he spoke to the leaders of Catholic Charities and affiliated organizations. And it's a beautiful address, and I took a small excerpt, which I'll read to you, to close out my remarks. This is the Pope. Jesus Christ was born poor. He lived poor, and he died poor. He loved the poor. The Church cannot be any different. She must be ever more fully aware of her fundamental duty to reflect in her life and action the very love with which God loves his creatures. For what is at stake is the mystery of God's love as explained in the first letter of John. We, for our part, love because he first loved us. all service has its first moment in God. God bless all of you, and thank you very much for coming this morning and for supporting Catholic Charities in its wonderful work. Thank you.